Teddy, darling, are you ready to introduce our guest? Okay, so hello and welcome to Pet Talk with me, Anna, and have you forgotten your name? There we are. No, Teddy, and our guest today. Do you want to introduce our guest? It's Venkatesh. Hello, Surabhi.
Hi, Anna. Hi, Teddy.
Welcome back.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's so good to see both Teddy and you.
So this time I thought it would be good to hear a little bit more about the actual physical aspects of nutrition. And maybe just let's begin with what is actually good for our dogs to eat.
Yeah. That's a big question to start with. Yeah, so I think that there is a simple answer and then there is a not so simple answer. And I want to, and so I'm gonna try and do a little bit of both, answer in both formats a little bit. I think in general, what I do believe, and I think again, what is natural or what is species appropriate, so as to call, right? But also what most dogs will end up having access to is fresh food. And so the idea of dry food, the idea of kibble came in much, much later, right? And it actually came in because somebody saw dogs eating biscuits and gravy and said, okay, let me package this in a way that can be sold and can be mass produced, right? But up until that point, most dogs were eating fresh food and were actually eating human scraps. So whatever we didn't eat, whatever we wanted to discard, that's what dogs were largely eating. And so I think that there is 100% merit to saying that fresh food is what is good for our dogs. But I think that and I think this is where the complexity comes in, because I think as we have evolved, especially as our knowledge of dogs have evolved, as our understanding of nutrition has evolved, fresh food for dogs has also become really complex. It involves a lot of different things now. And I think a part of that complexity is also the fact that it is not financially feasible and accessible to a lot of dog caregivers and guardians. And for them, dry food then becomes a more economic alternative. And so I don't think it's fair to approach what is good for our dogs in terms of binary concepts, to say fresh food is good and dry food is bad, because there is a lot of complexity to this. There is a lot of restrictions. There's a lot of provisions to all of these things. But I like to approach it by saying we cannot argue with the importance of fresh food for our dogs. I think we have to acknowledge that that is how they eat. Essentially, that is how all animals eat, and our dogs also eat that way. Having said that, there are individual variations and individual differences that we need to then account for, and that comes in both from the perspective of what is possible for the caregiver, but also, sorry, just give me 1 second. 1 second. Yeah, so what is also possible for the caregiver, but what is also appropriate for the dog, right? And I think what I find in most narrative is we focus a lot more on what is appropriate for the dog and forget about what seems feasible for the dog parent, which then also leads to a host of other issues. Yeah.
Yeah, just listening to you, I'm just thinking about how, particularly in the West, we, as the human side of the equation, have become extremely reliant on processed foods. And we're having to learn that actually that's not a good idea and go back to fresh foods. Um, and, in my practice as a therapist, funnily enough, I actually spent a good deal of time in coaching many of my clients on how to get back into the kitchen and start cooking, but within a way that's feasible for them when they're working long hours, etc. And I think in a sense, we're doing the same thing with dogs, where we're relying very much on processed foods and forgetting that that's not how they naturally eat. So you're right, it's finding that middle ground. And I think one of the things that I've been working on with my clients is saying, okay, if you must have processed food, what can you look for that is the healthiest option within that? And I think that's really important. And we could be doing the same thing for our dogs. And maybe it's not every meal that's dried. Maybe there's some meals that are fresh. It's a difficult thing. I didn't feel I had much choice with Teddy because his allergies were such that there was nothing on the market that didn't have something he wasn't allergic to. Yeah. So very quickly, that was an option that was closed off for me. But I'm actually very grateful for that because it made me look deeper into what I was feeding him.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think just language also makes such a difference, right? To be fair, everything that even we eat today, if I had to get like really specific about it and very anal about it, everything that we eat today is also processed in some way and form, right? Because the most natural form of food would be essentially to take out from the trees or take out from the soil, right? But as soon as they get washed and cleaned and cut, there is some form of process that's applied to it, right? So I think the conversation really is about how much of ultra processed foods are we consuming and our dogs consuming, right? And I think again, I find that that's important for us to hold space for, because the minute I start conversation about ultra processed foods, I think people get it faster, right? And I think that it's also equivalent to saying in the human context, you cannot be eating ultra processed food. Ultra processed foods is your primary diet, right? That's not what you're going to be able to consume on an everyday basis, because eventually, one, you're not getting your full nutritional requirements from that. But two, that's also, you're essentially going to get to a point where your body just doesn't feel good about that kind of consumption. And that is pretty similar to what our dogs also experience. And so exactly to what you said, that is precisely what I share with my clients, especially those who struggle with meal prep, struggle with making time, struggle with financial resources, struggle with accessibility to resources, to saying, I understand that ultra processed food is your option right now, but can we try and include as much of fresh food into the diet, right? And even if you're doing that once a week, twice a week, can you at least start doing that as opposed to not doing that at all, right?
Yeah. So one of the things that I found when Teddy was a puppy, and this is before we discovered the allergy issue, is that very quickly he decided that kibble was the most boring thing in the world. And I hear this from a lot of people. It doesn't matter what flavor, you change it to, that the dogs are not happy with it. So I started being innovative, and I would give him, his meals, but then I would add things to them. Might add some, little bits of vegetables or chicken or whatever to it to make it more palatable. And his treats were always very pure in the sense that they were, dried meat of some kind, without anything else. Or I would cook liver for him and, give him bits of liver as treats and things. So is that something that maybe other people can be thinking about?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are so many different ways to integrate fresh food into the diet, right? I don't think, and again, I think that's the idea of giving our dogs choices, but that's also the idea of giving dog parents choices, right? To show them that there is more than one way of doing this. And what I mean, again, I've found both situations where clients have come to me because their dogs have been eating kibble for most of their lives and now they've just stopped eating it. They're not interested in it and they want to transition. I've also found clients who have not been able to, let's say, offer too much variety with fresh food, but once they start doing it, they're able to notice differences in how the dog approaches food. And that prompts them enough to switch completely to fresh food as well. And so I think that it is. I think there are lots of different ways to facilitate fresh feeding for our dogs. It completely depends on what the dog parents' bandwidth, capacity, accessibility looks like. And I also think it comes down to, I think, how much as a professional you're willing to thought partner and problem solve and collaborate with them. I think that for most part, my experience of nutrition consultants in the dog nutrition space has been um, very rigid, very judgmental. Um, there's almost a sense of, in conversation, in messaging, creating a lot of shame and guilt for the dog parent. Um, I don't think any of that is helpful. And I don't think any of that helps them get that message better. So I think it does
It's
come down to how you problem solve with them as well.
absolutely, it's neither helpful nor necessary. It's not. Because everybody wants the best for their dog.
Yeah.
And that would be the reason why they were consulting in the first place. So that's not the willingness is not the missing ingredient. It's
Yeah.
the so let's think then about what dogs actually need. Um, because there's been quite a lot of I think controversy about the amount of protein, for instance, that dogs should be having. We know that they're not carnivores like 100% of the time. They're more like us. They're omnivorous. So what what is the latest understanding of protein and the importance of protein versus, say, fat and carbohydrate?
Again, that's a really complex answer, Anna. And I think it's because, so I have a couple of different observations, right, about, I think, latest understanding in general on what dogs need. I think one is a big part of the research and the science that we see today is very, very Eurocentric, dominated by a European American narrative, right? A lot of that research does not include Asian and African countries. And that's important only because food is also cultural. It also tells us a lot about a society, about culture, about preferences that are very localized and regionalized, right? And so I think that when we end up missing out on Asian and African, Middle Eastern narratives, we don't get the full picture. It's not representative at all, right? So I think that's one part of the problem. I think the second part of the problem is that we are very quick to determine what dogs need based on the idea that they have evolved from wolves. But we negate or neglect the fact that 70 to 80% of the dog population across the world are free living dogs. And um, there is very little space in the narrative of dog nutrition for what does the diet of a free living dog look like. And to me, the equivalent is to me, the equivalent is if we have to understand what humans should eat, essentially on the same parallel, we're saying, let's go back to what apes were eating, as opposed to thinking about how we have evolved from that, right? And because of those two missing pieces, I think there is a lot of information and a lot of understanding that in general we're missing out on, right? Because, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I absolutely, because when I asked you the question, I think in my mind, I was thinking, what would dogs eat in the wild? You know, what would they eat? And no, not wolves, because they're not wolves.
Yeah.
But what are they eating? And then I was listening to, I was thinking about foxes, because foxes are wild dogs, really. And I think they eat whatever they can get is the answer, which means that they're not going to be very particular. Um, but on the other hand, that's not necessarily a fair perspective, because unlike domestic dogs, they may well not have a lot of choice because they're eating what's available to them. So it's a funny question, isn't it? Because if we're hungry, if we're starving, we may not be very fussy and eat whatever we can get hold of.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, that's not necessarily going to be reflecting what we actually need. So it's one of those funny things. What I do feel looking at Teddy and all of his friends is that there is an absolute preference for meat.
Mm-hmm.
And the protein seems to be, and I think maybe that's a clue.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think again, right, I think language, I've come to realize the importance of language in the words that we use, because they obviously paint a certain picture, right? And so every time I think we say dogs in the wild, I think immediately our minds go to wolves or dogs in a forested area. But for me, domestic dogs, especially domestic dogs, to me, I look at what their natural environments are, right? And when I think about free living dogs, it's pretty much the streets and parts of and parts of urban residences, and a lot of their source, I mean, their source of food essentially comes from garbage, right? Because domestic dogs are also scavengers, and what they are sourcing from that garbage is human scraps, right? And so again, when we look at diets for free living dogs, and there are some studies that have been done again in Africa, some studies in the Middle East, some studies in Central Asia, and all of these places, when we look at the diets for these dogs, we see that there is a lot of grain component, because grain's a big part of human diets. There is vegetable, there is protein, the meats. There's also a very large presence of fecal matter, right? There are small animals. And so we see that, oops, are you still here? I think I've broken up. Oh, yeah, you're here.
A lot of fecal matter.
Yeah, there's presence of a lot of fecal matter, there's presence of small animals. They're scavenging, right? They're picking out whatever works for them with their bodies. And I think again, it's important to remember that with domestic dogs, because and free living dogs particularly, because they also have natural intelligence for self-selection. They also have natural intelligence to understand what is safe for their bodies, what is not, how much of something do their bodies need, which I think for most part, a lot of our pet dogs, especially in restricted, constricted homes and lifestyles, don't necessarily tap into that intelligence, right? They are largely dependent on us to make those decisions for them. And so I think that yes, their diet is 100% varied. And in fact, I know of a study that was done on Indian free living dogs where they were where they were studying scavenging habits for these dogs to see whether these dogs preferred protein or preferred carbohydrates. And the first choice was protein. However, they did not ignore the carbohydrates as well. And so it was both. And to me, when I think about what is a balanced diet for a dog, a balanced diet for a dog includes all food groups. It does not eliminate a particular food group. Now, how much of each food group comes in, that's very different, but it is all food groups. And so, yes, of course, protein is important. I think it's also important to understand that these dogs they are a different species. Their nutritional requirements will look slightly different. So protein definitely continues to be a high component of that diet. Having said that, that in no way means that grains are not necessary for them or grains are bad for them, in the way that grains have largely been demonized, by the way, both in dog as well as human diet narrative, right? I know of so many situations and so many health conditions where the dog is not able to digest large amounts of protein. And so what balance looks for that particular dog looks very different from what it will look like for another dog.
Yes, and again, it comes back to understanding the overall and then tweaking it to suit the individual dog. I've also been thinking a lot about gut health. And so I guess the question in my mind is, what would be good prebiotic and probiotic foods for dogs?
Yeah. Again, I think with gut health, when we talk about prebiotics, probiotics, a lot of fermented foods, those are great. And again, even in the diet, like for example, I know Dr. Ian Billinghurst talks about this. He talks about how dogs would largely consume fecal matter, and they would get the necessary probiotics from that fecal matter. Right. And so he talks a lot about the importance of fermented foods as a source of probiotics for dogs. And so you look at fermented vegetables, you look at kefir, you look at even yogurt, with certain kinds of bacterial strains. You look at soil-based probiotics. Again, a lot of dogs will eat soil, but that's also a way for them to get the necessary good bacteria that they need to. And so you look at all of these different things that can help improve gut health. But I think it's also important to remember, and this is where I remember when I started talking about this, I didn't get a lot of traction because I was moving away from a certain narrative. Gut health is also largely impacted by stress. And our pet dogs experience a fair amount of stress in their day-to-day lives with us, right? And so I think that when we look at gut health, again, this becomes very complex because yes, diet is a part of it, but if you feed your dog a high quality diet, you feed your dog the right amount of probiotics, prebiotics, but you are not taking care of how they're responding to their environment, or if you're not addressing the stressors in their environment, you are likely to have a dog who continues to struggle with poor gut health, because there is that connection.
I'm just said that because so many dogs want to eat what we consider to be dangerous and absolutely disgusting, of course.
Yeah.
But to think that they may be treating that as a fermented food is absolutely fascinating. And the eating of soil, yeah, Teddy likes to eat mud. And he doesn't do it quite as much as he used to, because actually he did eat so much of it on one occasion that it made him throw up. So he's cut back on that.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, he still likes to have a good dig, and in winter particularly, and eat mud. And I noticed some of his friends still like to do that too. So this is very interesting, that there's the possibility here that this is their way of getting a probiotic food. I do give him yogurt with made from goat's milk, because of his allergies, because I knew that. But it also made me think about some work that's been done in human
Mhm.
circles where they've been transferring fecal matter from
Yeah,
one person to another to improve their gut health because there are
yeah,
bacteria present in one person and
yeah,
not the other. And it has an effect on weight,
yeah,
uh, as well as allergies and other things.
yeah.
So now I'm thinking about it. I think we may be onto something here as with why dogs like to eat what we consider to be the most disgusting thing ever.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I've heard Dr. Amber Batson talk a lot about the gut microbiome. She also talks about a little bit on fecal matter transplant. I don't know whether it's done. I don't think it's done extensively yet on dogs, but very similar to what you're saying. I think the evidence on humans suggests that this could be a possibility for dogs, especially with chronic gut health conditions. But that makes sense, right? Because 70 to 80% of the immunity in our body comes from the gut, comes from those cultures of good bacteria. And for whatever reason, if the gut environment of the microbiome is not conducive for these new cultures of good bacteria to grow, then obviously immunity is compromised. And I'm really simplifying it, right? Of course, the body works much more complexly, but obviously immunity is compromised. And when immunity is compromised, there is a host of other issues. But those gut bacteria also play an important role in absorption or malabsorption of food. And so you could see both weight gain, but also consistent or chronic weight loss, along with a host of other issues. And so I think that anything to do with food habits, right, has both a dietary component, but also an environment and lifestyle component. And so I think to reduce it to either or becomes a big, big issue. And so in fact, just the other day, I was talking to a client of mine whose dog eats her own poop. And we looked at we looked at both diet modifications, but also looked at stressors, especially around the time of pooping. And so you have to look at both things together when we look at food habits. It's never really just one singular factor. And I think that's also uh, what makes the what makes the sole focus narrative on nutrition very dangerous, because we end up, and at least this is what I've experienced over the last few years, we end up making diet like a magic bullet for dogs, and it isn't a magic bullet. It is one of the very important things that one needs for optimum well-being and welfare, but it is one of the things. It is not the only thing.
It is always the way that we're looking for a magic bullet for everything. We want to find that solution, and everything is always very complex, which is, of course, why um, different modalities of healing that are not often are better at doing that because they're more holistic in their approach and looking at the emotional needs of the dog clearly has to play a part because we know that our gut health is affected by stress. So they are going to be affected too. There is also, I find, with some dogs, a real interest in eating grass. Teddy loves eating grass. Do we know why that is?
I mean, again, I think there are multiple different hypotheses, and again, that could it could look different for different dogs, right? For some dogs, it could be to gain a source of fiber that's perhaps missing in their diet. And again, I think that I'm going to caveat the missing. I don't think it's so much about missing, but I think it's about recognizing what is the quantity in which a particular dog needs something. And so it's very much possible that you're adding fiber sources, but maybe your dog needs more of it or different kinds of fiber sources to be able to meet their own needs. I think that's one. I think the other one is largely what we see is dogs will also use grass as a way to purge themselves and to remove any buildup of toxins that are there in the body. Dogs are also likely to eat on grass when their tummies are just feeling unsettled. It may not necessarily it may not be followed with purging, but it could just be poor gut health, could be acidity, could be anxiety that shows up in very gut-like symptoms. And so in general, I think that I don't necessarily discourage dog parents from letting their dogs eat grass, because to me, it's also a way of the dog meeting their own need, um, and figuring out what is important for their system. I think you have to look at that behavior again in context of multiple other things. You have to look at that behavior in context of, okay, is my dog experiencing stress in the environment of late? Is my dog experiencing a change in appetite? Is my dog experiencing a change in eating preferences? Is my dog feeling under the weather? I think it comes in tandem with a lot of different things, and that's when we can address, that's when I think we can really determine whether or not it's an issue or not, right? But for most part, it's not. But again, I think with different dogs it looks different.
Yeah, it with him it's young grass. He seems to like young grass in
Mm.
springtime particularly.
Mm.
And so he licks it, he sniffs it, and he nibbles on it. Maybe he's not as much as I think, because actually thinking about it, it's more about sniffing and
Yeah.
lick. And
Yeah.
it's not strictly speaking seasonal, but it's definitely the spring is when he likes it best,
Yeah.
uh, when it's new. And one thing that I have learned is that plants are at their most potent. The leaves of plants are at their most potent in springtime.
Absolutely.
He's clearly identifying that that's the best time of year.
Absolutely, 100%. I mean, every time, for example, I love the smell of wet mud, especially after you water your garden or it's rained. There's something very comforting and lovely about that. Uh, I mean, it looks, I mean, it works great for me. For a dog, we're accessing so many more different scents, and it's a whole complex world, right? And again, I think another thing that a lot of times I think dog parents get stressed about is dogs do make sense of the world by putting things in their mouth. That's the way that they explore things. So it may not always necessarily, it's not necessary that they're going to digest it completely. But like you said, it could be nibbling, it could be, keeping things in their mouth as a way to just get a sense of what's going on. Um, but again, with each dog it will look very different, because then we also have situations where dogs scavenge excessively when they're outside, and that could be a result of something else going on in the dog's body and environment. So I think it is definitely that individualized context.
Well, it certainly is full of complexity, as it is for us, for the human side of everything. So it's not surprising that there is a complexity here, when we're looking at what dogs need. And I guess the last question that comes to mind is the idea of ratios. And I think you kind of touched on that before, but if you look at doggy cookbooks,
Mm-hmm.
be this prevalent idea that it should be a third protein, a third carbohydrate, and a third fat. And I guess my question is, where is that idea coming from, and how do you feel about it?
So I do think that there is some merit to, I wouldn't say ratios. I would say I think there is some merit to thinking about quantities of food groups and portions of food groups. Um, because again, I think it's a guidance on how much to feed what of, right? Because within that guidance, we can attempt to find some balance. I think the problem, however, becomes when we become extremely prescriptive about those quantities, or when we when we become really prescriptive, but when we also fail to factor in what is the dog's feedback on those quantities. And so I think that in general, I think those guiding principles are fair, but again, for each dog, they will look so different. And so for some dogs, maybe they would prefer a higher ratio of meat or a higher ratio of bone or a higher ratio of vegetables. And that's absolutely okay as well. For some dogs, it could look very, very different. And so, again, I think that the problem with a lot of these ratio diets is in the way that they are talked about and marketed, to say that they are complete, these are rigid, this is what you must follow for your dog to experience, great health. And I think that's where the complication comes in, right? But I also think it's important for us to remember that with food, and I think those are the challenges with, I think, nutrition in general. I think with food, you cannot be so prescriptive and you cannot get so normative, because what we eat, how much we eat, is also influenced by so much that happens in our body. And I think when we don't allow space to acknowledge that for our dogs, we almost treat them like we treat food with them very robotically. I've given you this much, and so this is what you must eat, irrespective of the day that you've had, irrespective of what you're feeling. We don't do that to ourselves. We don't eat a third of protein, carbs, and fats. It varies for us day on day. It varies for us mood by mood. And so I think start with it from a guideline perspective, but I think not get so hung up about it to say this is the only thing for our dogs.
So, as ever, watch your dog and learn from your.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
100%.
Well, Surabhi, thank you so much for taking the time to tease out some of the complexities of a very important aspect of our dogs' lives. Thank you very, very much for your time today.
Of course. Thank you so much, Anna. It was lovely catching up with you again as well.
And if people want to find you, how do they do that?
They can find me on my website, which is luchiandmuttons.com. And then that will give them a view of other channels that I'm on. But I would say the website's the primary one. Yeah.
And you do consultations online, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. So I do virtual consultations that are open to dog parents across the world. So yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much once again.
Yes. Thank you so much, Anna.
And thank you all for watching. And we are going to be looking at joint pain in older dogs, as well as other aspects of aging in upcoming Pet Talks. Until next time, goodbye.